Radio stations are built to survive the absence of the people who operate them. A microphone can be left open. A record can continue turning after the announcer walks out. Automation can identify a station, read the weather, and fill an empty hour with a voice recorded years before. But every broadcast still requires something physical. A studio, a transmitter, an antenna standing somewhere in the world. That is the comforting part of radio. However distant a voice may sound, it has an address. Tonight, I have 3 original accounts about stations that lost theirs. Their towers were cut down. Their studios were crushed, sealed, or dropped into the sea. Engineers watched the carrier's signals disappear. Then, after the demolition crews went home, the broadcasts resumed. The first account is called The Night Host at Rookfield. I spent 23 years taking radio towers down, and the only one I was ever afraid of was already lying on the ground. The station was WCRK 1040 on the AM dial, licensed to Rookfield County. By the time I saw it, the license had expired, the call letters had been reassigned, and the county had bought the property for a highway interchange. 4 towers stood in a soybean field behind a low brick studio. They were narrow red and white masts, each 200 feet tall, arranged in a diamond to push the station's nighttime signal away from a larger city to the east. My company had 10 days to remove everything above the foundation. I was the site supervisor and the only broadcast engineer on the crew. That meant I handled the transmitter, the antenna matching network, and anything with enough stored voltage to kill someone after the utility disconnected the building. The county project manager met us at the gate on a gray Monday morning. Her name was Patricia Lyle. She had a ring of keys, a folder of asbestos reports, and the nervous efficiency of someone who expected the property to resist being sold. She asked me to verify that WCRK was off the air before we started. I showed her the portable spectrum analyzer. At 1040 kilohertz, the display was flat except for distant interference. I tuned the radio in my truck to the same frequency. There was only the dry, irregular crackle of an empty AM channel. Patricia listened for longer than the demonstration required. Then she asked, "If it starts talking, does that mean there's still electricity in the building?" I thought she was worried about the demolition permit. I told her a transmitter that size could not operate accidentally. It needed 3-phase power, cooling fans, an exciter, and a functioning antenna system. Even if somebody started the generator, the severed studio link would leave it with nothing to broadcast. "So if we hear a voice," she said, "it isn't coming from here." I told her that was correct. She looked relieved in a way that made no sense to me. WCRK had begun as a farm station in 1948. The lobby walls held photographs of livestock auctions, election night panels, school choirs, and men in ties leaning toward chrome microphones. The most recent picture was already 20 years old. The station had spent its final decade selling blocks of airtime to preachers and playing old country songs from a computer no one had bothered to remove. The main studio was almost empty. A cracked desk faced a dark window. Acoustic foam hung from the walls in curling squares. On a shelf beneath the console, I found several hundred index cards bound with rubber bands. Every card contained a name, a road, a vehicle description, and a time written in blue fountain pen. The earliest cards dated to 1971. The latest was from the station's final week. Most of the times were between midnight and 3 in the morning. Patricia took the cards from me and returned them to the shelf. "Those stay until the building comes down," she said. I asked whether they were contest entries. "Listener reports." Owen Rusk kept them. I recognized the name from a faded poster in the hall. Owen Rusk had hosted a program called Night Roads for 38 years. The poster showed a thin man with heavy headphones and silver hair, smiling behind a microphone. Beneath him, a slogan read, "If you're awake, you're not alone." Patricia told me Night Roads had been practical radio. Rusk read weather warnings, school closures, and overnight road conditions. Truckers called when deer were on the highway or ice formed on the bridge. People working third shift let him know when they arrived safely. The program made Rusk a minor local institution. He retired? I asked. He died at that desk, she said. 1998. They found him after sunrise with the microphone open. She would not say anything more. We spent Monday locking out the electrical service and draining oil from the transmitter. On Tuesday, the rigging crew dropped the first 2 towers. A tower does not fall like a tree. We cut the correct guy wires with a hydraulic tool, pulled the base pin, and guided the mast into its collapse zone with a winch. It folded as it landed, each steel section striking the next until 200 feet of antenna became a waist-high ribbon in the mud. At 12:47 that night, my phone rang in the motel. Patricia was on the other end. She asked whether I had left a radio running at the site. I said no. Then turn one on, she said. I used the alarm clock beside the bed. The tuner was digital, but it covered AM. At 1040, a man was reading a list of county roads in a calm, intimate voice. There was no music behind him and almost no static. He said the pavement was dry on Route 17, fog was forming near Baxter Creek, and the north lane of County 6 had a dead doe on the shoulder. Then he thanked a caller named Lorna for checking in from the paper mill. And for those of you passing the old WCRK field, he said, keep your eyes ahead. 2 of our towers are down tonight, and they do not appreciate being looked at. The signal vanished. I sat on the edge of the motel bed with my hand on the radio. Patricia asked if I had heard him. I said somebody was using the frequency illegally, probably with a low-power transmitter near town. Radio enthusiasts rebuild old programs all the time. A recording could explain the reference to WCRK if the person transmitting it had been watching our work. Was it Owen? She asked. I had never heard Owen Rusk alive. I said I did not know. It was, Patricia said. He always comes back when something here changes. The next morning, I connected the spectrum analyzer to a calibrated loop antenna and drove through Rookfield. If a pirate transmitter was operating, I could follow the signal strength to its source. At noon, the channel was empty. I parked at the station and waited through the hour when the previous broadcast had begun. At exactly 12:47, a carrier appeared. It was strongest beside the demolished towers. The signal dropped when I drove toward town and rose when I returned to the field. I walked the site holding the loop at chest height. The reading peaked beside the cut end of tower number 2's feed cable. The cable was no longer connected to an antenna. It ended in the mud. Through my headphones, Owen Rusk welcomed listeners to Night Roads. He gave the correct date. He described roadwork that had started that morning. Then he said my name. Noel Avery is walking the south field with a very expensive radio, he said. Noel, you can stop looking. We are exactly where we have always been. I pulled the headphones off. The analyzer continued drawing the sharp peak of a powerful local carrier. According to its field strength estimate, WCRK was transmitting at close to its old licensed power of 10,000 watts. No generator was running. The transmitter cabinet was open and empty. Half the directional array was scrap metal. I called the Federal Communications Commission field office. An engineer there recorded my report and checked the remote monitoring network. Their nearest receiver showed no signal at 1040. I emailed a screenshot from my analyzer. He suggested overload from another transmitter, though there were no active towers within 7 miles. When I returned to the studio, Patricia was sitting at the old console with the index cards arranged in rows. She had separated the cards into 2 groups. The first held ordinary check-ins. The second held names of drivers who had later died on county roads. Some deaths happened the same night Rusk wrote the card. Others happened months later. One card listed a high school teacher named Michael Penn, Route 17, Green Buick, 1:18 a.m. A newspaper clipping attached to it said Penn had died in a collision 9 years afterward, at the same time and on the same road. Patricia's father had a card too. She said Owen had read his name on the air when she was 12. Her father was home in bed, but their Buick sat in the driveway with the radio playing. 17 years later, he struck a fallen tree while driving home during a storm. The dashboard clock stopped at the time written on Owen's card. People said Owen predicted accidents. Patricia told me. He said he only reported arrivals. I asked what that meant. She showed me the final card in the stack. Owen Rusk, WCRK Studio. No vehicle. 5:41 a.m. That was the time the morning announcer had found him dead. Under the entry, Rusk had written one additional line. Do not let them check in early. I wanted the police involved, but there was no crime to report. A dead announcer's files and an unexplained carrier were not evidence of danger. I told Patricia we would finish the work in daylight and leave the building until last. We dropped the 3rd tower Thursday morning. That night, cars began gathering on Route 17. The first arrived shortly after midnight. By 1:17 vehicles were parked along the shoulder facing the station. Their engines were off, but blue dashboard light filled every windshield. None of the drivers got out. When I approached the first car, the woman behind the wheel locked her doors. I could hear Owen's voice through the glass. He was asking listeners to remain in their vehicles and leave the rear passenger seat empty. The woman lowered her window less than an inch. She said her radio had turned itself on while she was driving home. Owen had spoken her name and told her to pull over at the station. She had obeyed because he also told her that a pickup would cross the center line 2 miles ahead. 3 minutes later, she heard the collision reported by another caller. Every driver on the shoulder had received a warning. One had been told about a deer, another about a washed-out culvert. A young man said Owen had described a child standing in his lane where no child should have been. They believed the broadcast had saved them. They also believed they had to stay until Owen announced that they were clear to leave. At 1:18, he began reading their names. Each driver answered by flashing the headlights once. I ran to the first car and told the woman not to respond. She stared past me toward the field. In her back seat, the upholstery slowly lowered beneath a weight I could not see. All along the shoulder, empty cars settled on their suspension. Headrests tilted. Seat belts drew across vacant cushions. Windows clouded from the inside behind the drivers. Owen thanked each listener for checking in. Then the cars drove away. No one would speak to police. The woman told me she had felt somebody lean forward behind her and rest cold hands on the back of her seat. But the presence disappeared when she reached her driveway, and she believed that meant the warning had worked. On Friday, I refused to drop the last tower. The county could find my company or replace me. I was not going to complete a structure that had already learned how to broadcast through severed cable. At 12:47 Saturday morning, Owen came on the motel radio again. He sounded tired. He said WCRK had once served people traveling after dark. It gave them weather, company, and a voice to follow home. When a listener died with the station tuned in, some portion of that final attention remained on the frequency. The towers did not hold those people. the living listeners did. Every person who heard a name and imagined the driver attached to it created a destination. Every answer to a check-in made room for an arrival. I kept the list for as long as I could, Owen said. But the station is coming down, and they know this is their final night. He began reading names. I switched the radio off. His voice continued through my phone's speaker, though the phone was powered down. It came through the motel air conditioner, the smoke detector, and the electrical outlet beside the bed. From other rooms, I heard guests opening doors and asking whether somebody had left the television on. Then Owen read Noel Avery, Route 17, company truck, 2:06 a.m. It was 1:39. I drove to the station because every instinct told me not to. The parked cars had returned. There were more than 100 this time, filling both shoulders and the access road. The remaining towers stood above them without warning lights. Under the clouded sky, it looked like a black needle stitched through the center of the crowd. Patricia waited at the gate with bolt cutters. She had heard her father's name again. We entered the studio while Owen continued broadcasting from an unpowered microphone. The console meters moved. Behind the glass, the empty announcer's chair was turned toward us. The index cards trembled on the shelf. Patricia took her father's card. I found mine near the end of the file, written in the same blue ink as entries made before I was born. Noel Avery, Route 17, company truck, 2:06 a.m. Beneath my name was a second line. Brings down the last tower. I understood then that the broadcast was not predicting my death. It was assigning me a place in the program. My arrival time was when I would answer. Outside, engines started in sequence. The parked cars turned their headlights toward the field. Patricia opened the microphone channel. She spoke before Owen could read another name. She told every listener that WCRK was closed. She said there would be no more traffic reports, no more dedications, and no more check-ins. She used the formal sign-off required by the old license and gave the station's final operating date. The cars began honking. Owen's chair rotated slowly toward the microphone. Its cushion compressed. A pale indentation appeared in the dust where two hands rested on the desk. I pulled the emergency release for the tower's last set of guy wires. The mast fell across the field. As it struck, every radio went silent. The headlights went out. The weight lifted from the announcer's chair, and the index cards scattered across the studio floor. My watch read 2:06. The county demolished the building the following morning. I watched the excavator crush the studio, then stayed while the concrete footings were broken and buried. I checked 1040 on 3 separate receivers. The frequency remained empty. For almost a year, I believed we had ended it. Then Patricia mailed me a recording made by an automated traffic monitor 40 miles west of Rookfield. At 12:47 a.m., beneath the sound of an empty highway, a carrier rose at 1040. My voice welcomed listeners to night roads. I read the weather. I warned about fog near Baxter Creek. Then I thanked Patricia for checking in and asked her to leave the rear passenger seat empty. I do not remember saying any of it. WCRK no longer broadcasts from Rookfield. It broadcasts from the cars that drove away. Most nights, the frequency is quiet. But whenever I travel after midnight, I keep the radio tuned somewhere else. I am afraid of hearing my own voice announce that I have arrived. The second account is called the White Array. The White Array had been gone for 26 years when it began transmitting my employee number. At the time, I worked for a contractor that maintained remote monitoring equipment for the Northern Atmospheric Survey. Most of our stations measured ordinary things: wind speed, magnetic variation, auroral activity, and the slow movement of ice. The work took me into places where a machine could operate for 10 winters without seeing a human being. In February of my 6th year, our office received a fault report from Site Morrow 9. The coordinates were in a high Arctic valley 300 miles from the nearest permanent settlement. Our database showed a weather camera, a satellite uplink, and a battery shed at that location. The satellite report showed something else. Every night at 3:03, the site's wideband receiver detected a transmission on 5.81 MHz. It lasted 81 seconds. The carrier was powerful enough to saturate the receiver, but only at that one location. No monitoring station outside the valley heard it. The attached audio contained a woman's voice reading 5-digit number groups. Number stations are real. During the Cold War, governments used shortwave transmitters to send coded instructions to agents. The voice would read groups of numbers. Anyone could listen, and only the intended recipient could decode them. Most famous recordings are decades old. Hobbyists preserve them because the broadcasts feel like messages from a machinery of espionage that was never properly switched off. I assumed the Morrow signal was somebody rebroadcasting an archive. Then I heard my employee number in the third group. The next groups matched the serial numbers of the receiver and its satellite modem. The final 10 digits were the latitude and longitude of Site Morrow 9. My supervisor, Dallin, told me it was a diagnostic loop. The station had probably ingested its own configuration file and converted it to speech after a software update. I reminded him that the weather station had no shortwave transmitter and no speech synthesizer. He sent me anyway. I reached the Morrow Valley by cargo plane, then traveled the final 40 miles in a tracked utility vehicle. The driver who met me at the airstrip introduced himself as Noah Venn. He was perhaps 50, with a blonde beard bleached nearly white and a red scar across the bridge of his nose. He spoke in short sentences and never removed his gloves, even inside the heated cab. When I gave him the site coordinates, he asked whether the red lights had returned. I told him the database did not mention tower lights. It wouldn't, he said. They took the towers down. The drive lasted 8 hours. There was no sunrise that far north in February. Headlights opened a white tunnel through blowing snow, and the aurora moved above us like green smoke trapped beneath the stars. Noah explained that Morrow 9 had originally been a military radio installation. Locals called it the White Array. 12 towers stood across the valley, with an operations bunker beneath the central building. The official purpose was ionospheric research. Its unofficial function was the number station I had heard. In 1996, an avalanche crossed the site. 3 people died. The bunker was damaged, and the military decided it was cheaper to close the station than repair it. Demolition teams removed the towers and filled the underground rooms with concrete. How do you know all that? I asked. Noah watched the road through the moving snow. Everybody up here knew somebody who poured that concrete. We entered the Morrow Valley shortly after midnight. My GPS showed the weather station 2 miles ahead. Red lights appeared across the horizon. They formed a shallow arc, 12 points blinking in the slow pattern used on tall antenna masts. I could see stars between each light and the snow. There was no steel holding them up. Noah stopped the vehicle. "Those are the right heights," he said. We watched one complete cycle. The outer lights flashed together, followed by the inner pair. The sequence moved toward the center of the array like something closing its eyes. I used binoculars. Each red lamp illuminated a small halo of snow, but the light did not strike any tower beneath it. I told Noah they might be reflections from the weather station. He looked at me for the first time since they appeared. Do not give a thing an explanation until you know what the explanation requires you to do. We continued. Site Moro 9 stood on a concrete pad surrounded by broken foundations. The weather mast was only 30 feet tall. Its instruments operated normally, but its receiver showed a carrier already rising at 5.81 megahertz. The clock read 2:51. I connected my analyzer and confirmed that the signal was local. When I walked west, it weakened. When I walked east, it strengthened. The direction led away from the weather equipment to an empty rectangle in the snow. Noah brushed the surface with his boot. A metal hatch appeared beneath a thin crust of ice. It was not on our site plans. Warm air escaped around its edges. At 3:03, the transmission began. The woman's voice came through my headphones with no static. She read the date, my employee number, and the serial number of the receiver. Then she read a new group. Noah repeated it before she finished. 17042. He said it was the identification number of an avalanche beacon. Whose? I asked. He did not answer. The final groups translated cleanly into a set of coordinates 30 meters northeast of the hatch and a depth of 4.6 meters. Then the woman said, "Carrier remains open for response." For 6 seconds, I heard only a low electrical hum. Beneath it was the sound of somebody breathing through snow. Noah pulled the hatch open. A ladder descended into a concrete shaft lit by fluorescent tubes. Ice covered the upper rungs, but the air below smelled warm, metallic, and stale. According to every document I had, the shaft should have ended in solid fill. We climbed down 40 feet and reached a corridor. The white array had not been filled with concrete. The bunker was intact. Frost coated the walls and cable trays, yet the lights burned. Rooms opened on both sides, sleeping quarters with made beds, a kitchen with cups secured in wire racks, and an equipment room packed with gray receivers. Dates on inspection labels stopped in February 1996. Our boots left the only marks in the frost until we approached the radio room. Fresh footprints came out through its door. They crossed the corridor and ended beneath the ladder we had just climbed. The prints were narrow and deep, made by military cold-weather boots. Water still glistened in their edges. Noah placed one of his own boots beside them. The tread matched. He did not appear surprised. Inside the radio room, a microphone stood on a map table. Receiver dials glowed along one wall. A paper tape reader pulled a punched strip through its metal gate, though both reels were motionless. The tape moved out of an empty supply spindle and disappeared into an empty take-up spindle. Beside it, a teletype machine printed a line of numbers. I recognized the first group as the current time. The second was the temperature inside the room. The third was the pulse rate shown on my wrist monitor. The machine was not reporting stored information. It was describing us. Noah opened a steel cabinet and removed a station log wrapped in oilcloth. He knew exactly where to find it. The final entries had been written by an officer named Captain Irina Sorrell. She described an experiment called Project Palinode. The white array did not send instructions to agents. It listened for radio traffic that had not yet been transmitted. Engineers had discovered that the auroral conditions in the valley produced short echoes before a signal instead of after it. At first, the lead was less than a second. With the full array tuned, the station could receive emergency transmissions minutes, days, and eventually months before the person speaking them reached a radio. The number broadcasts were an index. They identified the future signal by date, location, and equipment. The station had predicted aircraft failures, shipboard fires, and military accidents. In each case, officials tried to prevent the event. In each case, The intervention changed the details, but not the final transmission. A different aircraft crashed. A fire started on a rescue vessel. The same words reached the array from a different mouth. The last pages concerned the avalanche of 1996. 7 days before it happened, the array received 3 emergency beacon signals from beneath the operations bunker. Only one of those beacons belonged to a person assigned to the station. Captain Sorrell ordered the towers demolished early. She believed removing the array would stop the future signal and prevent the avalanche. The charges were set for 3:03 a.m. At that exact time, all 12 towers transmitted simultaneously. The energy heated a layer of ice on the eastern ridge. A slab of snow 2 miles wide detached and crossed the valley. The demolition caused the event it was intended to prevent. The final log entry listed 3 beacon numbers. The second was 17042. Noah Vinn's name was written beside it. I read the entry twice before looking at him. He stood by the microphone with his head lowered. Snowmelt ran from his coat and collected around his boots. "You were here," I said. "I come whenever the lights do. You died in this bunker." "Not in the bunker. For 0.6 meters northeast of the hatch." Those were the coordinates the woman had just transmitted. The teletype began printing words instead of numbers. "Elena Ward will ask who is speaking. My name is Elena Ward." I heard myself ask the question before I realized I was obeying the paper. The radio answered in my voice. "This is Elena Ward at Site Morrow 9. One survivor in a void beneath the West Service Trench. Beacon battery failing. Air limited." The message was clean, calm, and unmistakably mine. I had never said those words. Noah checked the wall clock. It was 3:11. The teletype printed another line. "East Slope release at 3:17. We had 6 minutes. I reached for the microphone. Noah caught my wrist. "If you warn anyone now, the array will use the warning to happen," he said. I asked how we could escape without transmitting. He looked toward the fresh footprints in the corridor. "You follow your signal. I follow mine." We climbed the ladder into a wind that had doubled in strength. The red lights above the valley were no longer blinking. They burned steadily, revealing pale vertical shapes beneath them. For an instant, I could see all 12 towers as columns of blowing snow. Noah walked northeast from the hatch. I grabbed his coat and told him the coordinates led to the place he had died. He said they also led away from me. The eastern ridge made a sound too deep to resemble thunder. A dark line opened across the snowfield high above us. Noah pulled free and continued toward the point identified by his beacon. His old footprints appeared ahead of him one by one, filling themselves in before his boots came down. I ran west. The avalanche crossed the valley faster than anything that large should move. The air in front of it struck first. It lifted me from the ground, tore away my pack, and threw me against the concrete edge of a collapsed service trench. Then the snow arrived. There was no sense of falling or being buried. The world became pressure. My arms were pinned, my mouth filled with ice. Something heavy struck my shoulder, and the darkness became complete. When I regained awareness, I could move one hand. It touched corrugated metal inches above my face. The avalanche had folded a section of trench roof over me, creating a narrow pocket. I found my emergency radio trapped beside my hip. Its display was cracked, but the transmit light worked. The clock read 4:36. I knew what I had to say because I had already heard it. "This is Elena Ward at Site Morrow 9. One survivor in a void beneath the West Service Trench. Beacon battery failing. Air limited." As I spoke, A second copy of my voice came through the receiver one fraction of a second before each word left my mouth. The white array was still listening ahead. Search crews reached me 11 hours later. They found my signal because the satellite receiver at Morrow 9 had forwarded it before the avalanche destroyed the weather mast. They found no trace of NOAA. At the coordinates northeast of the hatch, they recovered an avalanche beacon manufactured in 1989. Its identification number was 17042. The case contained a faded label with NOAA VIN's name. My employer insisted that I had traveled from the airstrip alone. The cargo pilot remembered no driver. Vehicle records showed the tracked carrier had been parked at the airstrip with its key inside. They assumed I drove it and invented a companion after the trauma. Dallin later found a military casualty report from 1996. It included a photograph of a young radio technician with a blonde beard and no scar across his nose. NOAA VIN had been recovered from beneath 4.6 meters of snow. A metal antenna support had cut his face before he died. The white array is still listed as demolished. Satellite photographs show only the weather pad and a new line of avalanche debris. No bunker entrance is visible. But every February, the red lights return above the Morrow Valley. At 3:03 a.m., the receiver detects a woman's voice reading 5-digit groups. The first numbers belong to equipment that has not been built yet. The last are coordinates beneath fresh snow. My employee number no longer appears. My voice does. It identifies the future signals now, and after every transmission, it leaves the carrier open for a response. The final account is called Radio Halcyon. I was hired to prove that a radio station was not standing in the North Sea. That sounds like an easy survey. Buildings do not become difficult to locate simply because people disagree about them. But the structure in question had been demolished so completely that the government possessed film of its upper deck falling into the water. Radio Halcyon had operated from a former naval fort on Gannett Shoal. The fort consisted of 2 concrete towers joined by a steel platform, 7 miles beyond the coast. In the 1970s, a group of broadcasters occupied it, installed an FM transmitter, and began playing music outside the country's licensing jurisdiction. Halcyon became famous for staying on the air through storms. Its presenters read messages for fishing crews, relayed unofficial weather reports, and accepted calls from anyone awake after midnight. The most popular program belonged to Miriam Salt, a former Coast Guard dispatcher with a low, patient voice. She called her show the Lantern Room. In 1984, corrosion made the fort unsafe. Halcyon's crew moved ashore. The transmitter was removed, the antenna mast was cut into sections, and a naval demolition team placed charges in both towers. One collapsed. The other broke below the waterline. Divers confirmed that the platform lay upside down in 100 feet of water. For the next 4 decades, people along the coast reported hearing Radio Halcyon during severe weather. The reports were always similar. At 2:20 in the morning, an empty frequency at 98.3 FM became perfectly clear. Miriam Salt welcomed listeners to the Lantern Room. She gave the names and positions of vessels in the storm. Some were real boats transmitting on marine radio. Others had been missing for years. The station played no recordings that anyone recognized. It took telephone calls even though the fort had never possessed a working undersea phone line. And just before the signal ended, listeners saw red antenna lights offshore at Gannett Shoal. My field was marine acoustics, not paranormal investigation. I mapped underwater structures for cable companies, insurers, and government agencies. The contract asked me to run multi-beam sonar over the demolition site, identify any debris that might threaten a proposed power cable, and determine whether recent photographs of a standing fort were fraudulent. The project should have taken one tide. My survey boat was the Lark, a 30-foot aluminum work vessel operated by May Kell. May was in her 60s and had spent most of her life piloting divers and technicians around the shoals. She did not laugh when I explained the photographs. "You won't see it in daylight," she said. I told her sonar did not need daylight. It needs the bottom to stay where it is. We left harbor beneath a clear afternoon sky. The sea was calm enough to show individual clouds in its surface. At Gannett Shoal, I lowered the sonar head and began parallel survey lines across the coordinates. The wreck appeared exactly where the demolition chart placed it. One concrete tower lay on its side. The platform was inverted beside it. Steel beams and antenna sections formed a debris field extending northeast. Nothing rose within 60 feet of the surface. I completed 3 passes and saved the data. On the 4th pass, the sonar drew 2 upright towers. They appeared for less than a second, directly beneath the boat. A horizontal deck connected them 20 feet below the waterline. Straight vertical returns climbed from the deck to the surface, then continued above the sonar's measurable range. I blamed a multipath reflection. Sound can bounce between the seabed and a vessel's hull, creating mirrored objects that do not exist. I changed frequencies and ran the line again. The fort was gone. May asked if I had heard music. I removed one side of my headphones. A melody was playing through the marine radio. The display showed channel 16, reserved for distress and calling, but the sound had the narrow, warm quality of an old FM broadcast. A woman's voice faded in. "Lark, you are early," she said. "The lantern room opens at 20 past 2. May switched the set off. I asked whether she recognized the voice. Everyone my age recognizes Miriam. She started the engines and took us back to harbor before I could argue. That evening, May admitted that the government cable survey was not the only reason I had been sent to Gannett Shoal. She had provided the recent photographs. Her younger brother, Eli, had worked as an engineer on Radio Halcyon. Official records said he left the fort with the rest of the crew before demolition. May watched him come ashore. He found work repairing theater sound systems and died of cancer in 2007. 2 weeks after his funeral, May heard him call the lantern room. He told Miriam he was below the old platform and could not find the stairs. Miriam asked him to remain where the red light could reach him. Then she read a message from May that May had never sent. "Tell Eli I left the harbor lamp on." It was a phrase from their childhood. Their mother used it when someone was late coming home. May began recording every return of the station. Over the years, Eli's calls moved closer to the surface. First, he reported being beneath the platform. Later, he was in the lower tower. In the most recent broadcast, he said he could see the studio stairs. That was the night May photographed the fort standing intact beneath a storm. "He's climbing out," she said, "or something that knows his voice is." I wanted to withdraw from the project. Instead, I listened to her recordings. They contained details a hoaxer should not have known. One caller gave the registration of a trawler lost in 1976. Another described damage to a lighthouse lens that had not been discovered until the following morning. Beneath each voice, my analysis detected a repeated low-frequency pattern. It was not electrical hum. It was water pressure changing around a submerged room. The weather turned after midnight. A fast coastal storm moved in from the northeast, too small to appear in the afternoon forecast. At 1:40, May knocked on my hotel door and said the red lights were visible from the harbor. We took the Lark out again. I know that was reckless. I also know that once you hear a dead man describe his route home, professional caution begins to feel like abandoning somebody on the other side of a door. Rain erased the coast behind us. The Lark climbed dark waves and dropped hard enough to shake equipment from its brackets. At Gannett Shoal, two red lights blinked above the water. They were separated by the exact distance between the demolished towers. As we approached, a platform formed beneath them. It did not rise from the sea. It became visible in layers. First, the rain outlined railings. Then the railings acquired rust and rivets. Concrete darkened under the waves, and steel legs descended into water that should have contained only rubble. Within a minute, the entire fort stood against the storm. Yellow light filled a window on the upper deck. Our FM receiver turned itself to 98.3. Miriam's salt welcomed the coast to the lantern room. Tonight's first visitors are May Kell and Daniel Rohn aboard the survey vessel Lark, she said. They have come to determine whether we are still here. My name is Daniel Rohn. May brought the boat alongside a lower ladder. I secured a line and told her we should remain aboard. Then Eli's voice came through the radio. May, I found the stairs. She was over the rail before I could stop her. I followed because the Lark was rising and falling beside exposed steel, and because leaving her alone would have been worse. We climbed to the platform. Rust shifted under my gloves, but the structure felt solid. Inside, the fort was dry. A corridor led past sleeping cabins and a kitchen set for 6 people. Water pressed against the portholes at floor level, even though we stood 30 feet above the sea. Voices moved through the walls as if every room contained a radio tuned just below clarity. The studio was at the end of the corridor. An amber meter glowed above an analog console. Turntables rotated without records. Tape moved across the heads of a reel-to-reel machine, emerging wet from a slot in the wall and disappearing into another. An empty chair faced the microphone. Beyond the studio glass, the control room window reflected a woman wearing headphones. When I turned, nobody stood behind us. Miriam's voice came from the monitor speaker. Please close the door. We lose pressure whenever the sea gets in. May asked for Eli. He is on his way up, Miriam said. But a station cannot receive without transmitting, and it cannot transmit without a living carrier. The reel-to-reel machine clicked. My voice began playing from the tape. It described May opening the control room door. She had not moved yet. The recording continued. I heard myself tell her not to touch it. Then, 11 seconds later, May reached for the handle. I said the same words I had just heard. The tape was running ahead of us. Miriam explained that Radio Halcyon had remained on the air during the evacuation in 1984. A storm developed while the crew was removing equipment. 6 people sheltered in the fort, including Miriam. Officials on shore believed everyone had left and authorized the demolition before the sea became too rough for the naval vessel to hold position. The crew saw the charges detonate. For 11 seconds, the station broadcast from a platform that was already falling. Every receiver along the coast heard those final seconds. Thousands of listeners pictured the studio standing above the waves. That shared image gave the signal somewhere to return. A broadcast is only a place people agree to hear together, Miriam said. They demolished the concrete. They did not demolish the audience. The station resurfaced during storms because that was when the coast remembered it most strongly. Each listener who tuned in added detail. A railing, a stairway, a dry room. The voices of later dead arrived because the audience expected a station that never left anyone alone at sea. Eli had listened for years. When he died, he followed the frequency back. May opened the control room door. Cold black water stood on the other side, without flowing into the studio. A metal stairway descended through it. Far below, a pale figure climbed toward us, one hand moving from rail to rail. May spoke her brother's name. The figure lifted its face. It had no features until she recognized them. Then the water shaped itself into Eli exactly as he appeared in a photograph she carried, young and smiling in a radio Halcyon sweatshirt. He reached the top stair and pressed his palm against the water's vertical surface. May raised her hand to meet his. The tape machine played my voice again. When she touches him, the studio takes her weight. 11 seconds later, Miriam said the station needed a living carrier. I pulled May back. The water bulged through the doorway in the shape of Eli's arm. His hand opened and closed. Beneath his voice, hundreds of others called from the flooded stairwell. They were not asking to be rescued. They were asking us to stay tuned. The fort shuddered. Outside, the red lights brightened. Through the monitor, I heard callers from the coast saying the signal had never been clearer. Each call made the studio more solid. Miriam told me the storm would pass in 9 minutes. If the audience remained until then, Radio Halcyon would keep the platform above water permanently. Eli could leave. So could the others. The station only needed one of us to sit at the microphone and maintain the connection. On the tape, my voice accepted. It thanked listeners for keeping the harbor lamp on. It invited May to take her brother's hand. Then it began announcing a new nightly program hosted by Daniel Rohn. I listened to myself become part of the station 11 seconds before I made the choice. The microphone channel opened. I sat in the chair. Miriam said, "Welcome to the Lantern Room." I did not repeat the words from the tape. Instead, I read the demolition report. I gave the date, the coordinates, the names of the 6 people still aboard, and the identification numbers of the charges. I told the audience that the government had destroyed an occupied fort. I said every voice they heard belonged to someone who was dead. Then I asked them to turn their radios off. The monitor erupted with overlapping calls. Miriam's reflection appeared in the glass, no longer patient or human. Her face was a smooth surface moving with waves. She reached toward me from a room that was not behind the window. I kept reading. I told listeners that remembering a place was not the same as saving it. Listening was not rescue. If they wanted the people in the station to stop falling, they had to let the final 11 seconds end. One by one, the console meters dropped. Lights went out across the panel. The kitchen vanished beyond the open door. Rain passed through the corridor walls. The reel-to-reel tape slowed until my future voice stretched into a low, unintelligible sound. May stood before the wall of water. Eli smiled at her. This time his face did not depend on her recognition. He placed his hand over his heart and stepped backward down the flooded stairs. May whispered the childhood phrase about the harbor lamp. Then she closed the door. The last meter reached 0. The studio floor tilted. We ran. Each room disappeared after we crossed it. The corridor became an open catwalk above the storm. The catwalk became a line of rusted beams. By the time we reached the ladder, only one concrete tower remained, leaning toward the water. The lark rose beneath us on a wave. May jumped first. I landed against the stern rail as the fort folded into the sea without an explosion. The red lights went under last. At 2:31, exactly 11 minutes after the broadcast began, 98.3 went silent. The sonar survey the next morning showed the same demolition debris mapped on my first pass. No new collapse, standing tower, or intact room appeared on the seabed. My report identified the cable route as safe. It did not mention Radio Halcyon. May kept one copy of the recording I made from the studio. I kept another. For 3 years, the frequency remained empty during every storm. Then, last November, I received a small package with no return address. Inside was the portable FM radio May had carried on the Lark. She had died peacefully 2 weeks earlier. At 2:20 that night, the unplugged radio lit its tuning scale. My own voice came through at 98.3. It said the lantern room no longer needed a fort. The audience had carried pieces of it home in their receivers, their recordings, and the private act of wondering whether the station might return. Then May called the program. She said she had found Eli below the old platform. She said they could see the studio stairs, but the door at the top was closed. My voice asked whether anyone on shore had left a harbor lamp on. The radio is in a locked storage unit now, sealed inside a shielded case with its battery removed. During storms, the red tuning lamp still shines through the seams. I have never opened it again. But I know the station is broadcasting because the storage company sends an automated alert whenever sound is detected inside the unit. The alert always arrives 11 seconds before the lantern room goes on the air. You have been listening to the Ashen Frequency. All 3 accounts in tonight's transmission are original works of fiction. If you are listening after midnight, look at the radio nearest you and remember that every voice has to come from somewhere. Even when somewhere has been demolished,